I just came back from a trip to China in January 2025, and I thought I'll make a short video to give people a sense of what China is really like in 2025. I'd say this is based on my experience from a tourist perspective, so take it with a grain of salt. It's all relative at the end of the day. It's my first time in China in probably 15 years, and what I saw was very different from what is shown in the news. Probably some of it is true, but I think just like to give my perspective. So my hope is that I can provide you with an alternative perspective on what's happening on the ground, and hopefully this will shed a bit more light and give you a better understanding, another data point, if you will, of how life is like in China. So the first topic I'd like to discuss is transportation. The thing about China is that they really have built out their infrastructure quite recently, over the last 20, 30 years, right? If you compare this with the rest of society, it's honestly pretty recent. They were pretty backward until relatively recently in global terms. And because of that, they have the benefit of not having any legacy technology. The thing about old technology is that typically you have to rip and replace them, and that takes a lot of time, energy, and there's a lot of inertia. China doesn't really have that issue. And because of that, a lot of their infrastructure is very new, it's very clean, and it's incredibly fast and cheap. For example, when you travel between cities, in the US you might take a flight or Amtrak. In China, taking a plane is actually really slow. A lot of Chinese airports and airspace actually is restricted for the military. So typically you take the train because that's much easier, and also train prices are pretty cheap. So when I went to Shanghai and Hangzhou, the prices were honestly quite unbelievable. So I really just did one trip, and that's from Shanghai to Hangzhou. And this isn't even long-term travel like a month out. It's pretty short-term. It's probably within the week or maybe just a couple of days. And the thing is, a typical one-way train ticket from Shanghai to Hangzhou costs about $14 US. And the return is about $8, which is quite crazy, if you ask me. And what really shook me is that you can travel between places and cities in China for just about $20, which is, if you think about it, the price of an Uber in a major city like San Francisco or New York, and that's just a one-way trip. And this is a round trip, keep in mind, and the travel distance is probably around 107 miles between Shanghai and Hangzhou. And this trip takes about 15 minutes or so. Compare this with America via Amtrak. A round-trip Amtrak from New York to New Haven, Connecticut, will cost you about $118 US. And that's around 81 miles, more or less. So incredibly much slower, much less efficient, much more expensive. And a big part of this is, as I mentioned before, legacy infrastructure, right? America is a very old country in comparison. It's not a very old country, comparing it with the UK and London, but from an infrastructure standpoint, it's still newer compared to the UK and much, much older compared to China, which has these incredibly fast bullet trains for incredibly affordable price. The second thing is EVs, electric vehicles. I think one thing that struck me in Shanghai is that I live in a hotel pretty close to Main Street and the main highway, but I actually didn't really think too much about it. And it was only when I was about to leave that I realized, and maybe my mom made a comment as well, so all credit to me, that it was actually really quiet. And the reason why it's so quiet is because every car is almost electric, and that means that there's no combustion engine, there's no typical diesel noise, combustion engine noise, everything is electric. So I think that's one thing that's really true, is that the adoption of EVs in China is incredibly fast. It's a government mandate. The government invests a lot of energy and time into the research of lithium-ion batteries. So no doubt, they're leading. And you can see a lot of vehicles in China, whether that be BYD or some of the more local brands you never heard of, basically are a vast majority of the vehicles are local. And even their version of Uber, Didi, as in taxi, are electric. And probably isn't news to say that China is the most competitive electric market in the world, and many of their products, their EVs, are not only pretty good, but actually also incredibly affordable. And what struck me is that the city in general is actually quite quiet. A big part of it is due to these EV initiatives, if you will. But another thing is that maybe it's because it's in January, but I got a sense that the city is actually really quiet. And there weren't many tourists from Western countries at all. Pretty much every face out there was Asian, East Asian to be specific. And honestly, it gave me the sense that the economy hasn't fully recovered. And I think the truth is the news around China's struggling economy is definitely true. And the fact that China has granted visa-free access to a lot of countries to visit, as part of tourism, probably lends a lot of credibility to that claim. Another observation is that I actually didn't recognize a lot of brands in China. Obviously, you have the luxury brands, the Louis Vuittons of the world, and so on. But other than that, there's not many mid-tier Western brands, I want to say. I mean, don't take my word for it. But I just feel they have a completely distinct and separate economy and separate brands. And when I walk on Main Street, looking at a lot of the shopping streets, there's obviously the typical Western luxury brands, but there's a ton of local brands as well, which was interesting. And I think the thing is also that in other Eastern countries like Japan, you can still find equivalent companies or like the Google, the Yahoos, the Amazons of the world, whereas in China, these have been replaced by local equivalents like Baidu, Tencent, and their ecosystem products like WeChat. So it's almost like a different universe. So if you're a traveler, it's actually a great thing to be because it's so new. So let's shift gears a bit into maybe more technology and culture. I would actually say that Apple Maps is actually pretty good in China. Maybe they have a local provider or something, but Google Maps is basically terrible and unusable in China. Whereas Apple Maps is actually pretty accurate, and you can actually navigate using Apple Maps. They have an equivalent of Baidu Maps, but I personally enjoy Apple Maps UI, although Baidu Maps is pretty decent as well. And I think maybe shifting to more of the cultural side, so Didi, which is their version of Uber, I had a really interesting conversation with a Didi driver. And I essentially visited like a tourist site almost, that's like an hour away. And the drive, which took about an hour, gave us a lot of opportunity to kind of exchange notes, if you will. And one thing he said that kind of stuck with me is that the economy is not doing well at all. And he did mention that a lot of people have been laid off and have turned to driving for Didi to cover their expenses. And the nature of supply and demand market is that if you have many drivers and not many passengers, there's too much supply almost and too little demand. And so Didi will naturally pay lower wages because of the supply and demand mismatch. And at the end of the day, ride sharing is a market, right? So that's kind of how it is. So this driver itself, he's from a neighboring province called Fujian, which is quite a bit further from Shanghai. And he moved to Shanghai fairly recently, and not Shanghai proper, mind you. It's kind of like the outskirts of Shanghai. Because Didi drivers in Shanghai earn significantly more compared to those in Fujian. So he left his kids and family and parents behind because he needed to make more money. And apparently he isn't the only one. There's many of them who lost jobs and had to move from a different county almost to Shanghai area to get some jobs and to have, a better life, hopefully. And he seemed a bit down, but, he's still upbeat. And I guess a big part of it is being able to tolerate suffering being a big part of the Chinese culture. Another interesting aspect of culture that I kind of observed was the dating markets in Shanghai. There's a lot of parents who gathered in these public parks trying to advertise their sons and daughters. A lot of the dating opportunities are for women in their late 20s or 30s, what is commonly known in China as a shengnu, which is a single woman. And they don't mean it in a good way. They mean it in a slightly condescending way, that you're not married yet, where you're supposed to be, culturally and societally. That's the expectation. And I known of this phenomena for quite some time, but since I haven't been to China in 15 years, I thought it would be interesting to kind of go there with my mom to kind of just see what it kind of looked like. So we kind of searched for these parks in Shanghai, and we found one. And it was a pretty bustling market by any sense of the imagination. Parents were pretty aggressive trying to match me with their daughters because I was based in the US, and I guess I had a fairly good amount of education, good height, and that is very much in line with the traditional parent-driven approach to dating, right? That's kind of what they find to be respectable, if you will. And this seemed to be a regular event happening every Sunday. So I approach it more from a tourist perspective and, ask some pointed questions and try to get a sense of how real it is. And mind you, there isn't actually any pictures for these dating markets. They're mostly just words on a piece of paper. And then there's the contact details. And the parents actually, surprisingly, don't force the introduction. It is up to the suitor, in this case the man, who might be interested in the women, to actually reach out to them. So there's still a fair bit of tradition when it comes to this approach. And I think what was also interesting is that when I went with my mom, someone actually attempted to match her with an older gentleman. So there was a market for that as well.